Researchers locate a pot of honey that's 2,500 years old inside an inside an ancient Greek pot that was discovered in Paestum, Italy, that was found near Pompeii. And thanks to chemical analysis, they're able to actually discern that it is honey. And that is because when the pots were found, it was a mysterious sticky substance, and they had no real idea as to what it was.
Yeah. So these pots were found at a shrine in Paestum, Italy in 1954. So they've been under analysis for 70 years. And when they were initially found, people couldn't really make sense of what was in them. There were a number of chemical analysis tests carried out in the 50s and 80s uh, by the University of Oxford. And three separate times they concluded that it could not be honey, but was contaminated by honey. As in, honey got in, but wasn't the main content of the jar. And that's really down to the fact that in the 50s, especially, and again in the 80s, these tests for chemical analyses weren't very precise. You had to be pretty freaking obvious what you were in order for them to work.
And they ended up concluding that during these analyses that the jars held animal or vegetable fat that was contaminated with pollen and insect parts rather than just honey. Although when you really think about the composition of honey, the idea that there's pollen and insect parts inside of it really aren't that far of a stretch from the imagination, considering how natural honey has, you know, imperfections and impurities in it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because when we think of these chemical analyses, it's kind of hard to really grasp the fact that we are on the cutting edge of technology. And in the past, researchers didn't have access to the same techniques or abilities. And this is part of the reason why archaeologists as a whole will only excavate or research a specific part of a site in the hopes that in the future, additional information and additional techniques would be developed that they could utilize.
Yeah. Like, for example, here with this chemical analysis for these jars, what they relied on back in the 80s and 50s were what's known as solubility tests, which is basically you take a bunch of vials of different substances and you take some scrapings from the inside of where you of the thing you want to know what was in it, and you take some scrapings from inside the jar and you dip them in those various substances to see what dissolves it and what doesn't. And that gives you a broad range of options for what this can and cannot be. It's
However, the
yeah.
researcher Luciana Carvalho from the University of Oxford decided to use a different technique that is using the reflection of infrared light. And what it does is it effectively shoots this light at the material, and from there you can actually discern the chemical composition, which is totally fascinating. And
Yep.
here you can actually see a little bit of that honey residue in the jar that they're researching.
Yep. And what this new method that Carvalho used determined was it revealed that there were sugars present, specifically a high amount of glucose and fructose, which are the main sugars in honey. They're one of the like key components. Those two sugars.
And this came after they originally believed it to be degraded beeswax because of its similarity to beeswax and its high acidity. But they used a technique called gas chromatography as well as mass spectrometry to truly get the actual composition of it. You know, mass spectrometry basically puts it through a spectrometer that can show you the specific chemical composition of an element, which is
Yep.
totally fascinating, or the elemental composition of an item.
Yep. And then another researcher at Oxford named Elizabeth Perez uh, did some work on what proteins are in there because honey would contain proteins because it is an organic substance made by honeybees. And they found both royal jelly proteins, which honeybees secrete, and evidence of a parasitic mite that feeds on the larvae of honeybees. Now, honeybees make honey for their larvae. So if you have the honeybee jelly, and the protein for the thing that feeds on the stuff that jelly is for, it's probably honey.
But the interesting thing is that that parasitic mite is similar to one that they have today that is found in ancient Asian beehives. However, given the fact that it was located in ancient Greece, it probably was a similar but different type of parasite.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because they do also talk about like, oh, well, how is it preserved there for so long? Well, the cork seals that had been originally used had eventually degraded and fallen into the pot, which allowed air and other microbes, and a lot of those bacteria are thought to have consumed any of the sugars that were left over and produced additional acids and breakdown products, aka it helped ferment it a little bit. And
Yeah. Yeah.
what remained of the original residue was just an acidic, waxy residue at the bottom as well as the walls.
Yeah, basically, there's just a coating along the bronze edges of these jars themselves of just this very kind of, earwax looking, you know, gunk that is what remains of the honey that the bacteria just couldn't break down.
And
And
this is
it's,
a really
yeah,
cool example of a study that can go back and look at these older collections that have been excavated 50 to 100 years ago and reanalyze them with a modern light and a modern mindset because we have techniques that were not available in the past that could answer a lot of these questions. And this is part of the way we can actually try and tackle the curation crisis. I know we've mentioned it a few times, but museums and repositories and archives do not have enough space for everything that's being pulled out. So there's a huge, huge push to start and study and analyze these materials in a closer light because there's still so much we don't know. A lot of times, the initial research phase happens. They basically pack up, put everything in a box, and walk out.
yep. And like with these things here, these are very significant jars because the 8 jars that are being studied here, they're from a shrine. These were sacrifices and offerings to ancient proto-Roman deities. These, this, explains, a lot about what the society valued, how they worshipped their gods, what was offered, what is your relationship with your deities? You know, the off, do you offer wine? Do you offer, food? Honey in this case, what you offer says a lot about what your society values with how big of an impact religion has had on human, history.
Well, and honey is not an easy product to produce and to make. And it kind of gives us an insight too, also as to the potential diets back then. If we know
Yeah.
what foods and what items were available, we can more easily ascertain what the diets consisted of. So there's a
Yeah.
lot of valuable information to have been gained here, but the majority of it is around burial rites and the importance and the stratigraphy of society, which
Yeah.
this article does a really good job of highlighting. It's kind of a cool one that we haven't really had a chance to talk about very often.
Yeah.
But I think that's probably a great point for us on today's episode. Thank you guys for watching. Let us know your thoughts down below, and we'll see you in the next one.